Stephen's story, there are a few key topics to keep in mind. Middle school students playing high school sports, early warning signs of substance use, peer leadership, and negative influence, protective factors, punitive measures such as out-of-school suspensions, expulsions, removal from sports teams, and school-related activities. The teenage brain, changing consequences for student misconduct, length of stay in treatment, treatment versus incarceration, and giving people a second chance. Please hold all your questions until after Stephen is done speaking. To start today's program, we are going to watch a short introduction video, then Stephen will begin his presentation. Thank you.
The hardest part about addiction for me was being in a position where my life was a complete disaster and I wholeheartedly wanted to stop using, but I had absolutely no control to stop the show. I actually got to a point towards the end where I accepted my fate as prison and eventually dead.
For the first time ever, more than 100,000 deadly overdoses were recorded in the U.S.
A 13-year-old boy has now died after he was exposed to fentanyl.
Local law enforcement is bracing for the problems that could come with legalized marijuana. Federal law still classifies marijuana as an illegal controlled substance on par with heroin.
Experts are now calling vaping an epidemic.
Teens are being hospitalized with lifelong injuries, all because they're inhaling too much, too often.
Many students are using prescription drugs to try to gain an advantage studying.
Underage drinking is a problem nationwide.
So Michael, who's 16 months older than Stephen, they were like very different, you know, but still always hung out together and great friends. And then Stephen came along, and from a young age, we knew that, you know, he that's all he wanted to do was play sports. You know, like in one season he could be playing, you know, baseball, lacrosse, hockey.
So I would say it was good going into the time period when Stephen started becoming different and behaving irrationally during his junior year of high school. And when he started smoking pot and then using opioids, his grades in school went down and his whole attitude changed, and he was defiant and didn't think we had any right to tell him what to do.
And I remember him just screaming at my parents, and they would just get into these huge fights, and he was, you know, partially in denial that he was having a problem.
So Stephen got kicked off of his suffering hockey team, which made him refuse to go to school.
So what's he gonna do after school? Where his whole life, that's all he did was after school play sports. So now again, here he is. So who does he starts finding kids to hang out with what are they doing at 2:15? They're just going to get high somewhere, and, you know, because he wasn't the kid who was coming home and reading.
And I remember he punched a hole in his bedroom wall at one point, out of the anger of my parents trying to help him, and him saying that. It just felt like it was spiraling out of control at that point.
I came home from school, and apparently there had been some kind of fight between Stephen and my parents, and he had slammed the door on his way out, and so our side door's glass was shattered. And he just kind of laughed and thought the whole thing was hilarious and showed us a bunch of money that he had, and then just walked out of the house. And so you could just tell that he was in a completely different mindset, that it wasn't the same person that we grew up with.
Then later on, it became less of anger and more just like he was out of it, and like I couldn't communicate with him, and it was that was scary in its own way. Like I felt like he wasn't there.
I think if you would have known Steve during that time, you would have thought he was a terrible person. And like now I've gotten used to when someone's judging someone, like, you know, he stays home all the time, he just drinks alone, like he's a loser, that type of stuff. Like it gives you perspective to never think like that anymore. doesn't seem that it should have happened to Steve. Like, had a great life growing up, great support from his parents. Like, we were always there for him, but it's just like it can happen to anyone.
Everywhere he went, I went with him. He went to a treatment facility in California. I went out there with him.
There's 4 of us, so it's hard enough for them to, equalize their time amongst us. And when one of them is demanding their attention because he's at a point where he could die, obviously that takes precedent. There's really no argument.
All his trips to the Karen Foundation, at the Mountainside, every court date.
Kids or adults who don't have the support, they just can, either they're overdosing or they're living in the streets, and and then their life never gets on track.
And then you see the amount of friends he's had like overdose or die related to drugs and stuff like that. It's just like it's a miracle. Like, you should just be thankful that if you can go through like whatever it was, like an 8-year period of being on and off drugs, that you come out on the other side. It's just like, you're in the 1%.
Looking back on it, he needed our support. That was the only way that he was going to be able to get through this.
Stephen's life got on track because we helped him so much get on track. I mean, he did it in the end. He did what he needed to do, but I was never one to say, he just kick him out and he needs to hit rock bottom. And, I was more about the more support and the more help we can get for him. That's how he's going to make it, and he did.
Good evening. There were 3 common phrases that were said to me or sometimes yelled at me when I was a teenager struggling with substance use, behavioral, and mental health struggles. Stephen, why'd you do that? Stephen, what were you thinking? Stephen, what's wrong with you? I believe parents, teachers, coaches, principals, I believe they were asking the wrong questions. I believe the question they should have been asking is, Stephen, how can we help you? And so as you listen to my story, and there's going to be pivotal moments in my story where things could have been handled differently, I want you to ask yourself that question. How could we have helped this kid? The same kid that was called a junkie, a dope fiend, a drug addict, a drunk, a dropout, a felon, and for me, worst of all, was the all-encompassing failure. Words used to describe me, hurtful words used to describe me and others like me that contributed to my downfall and my inability to recover. But how does a downfall into the darkness of drug addiction even start in the first place? Well, so much of my life can be summed up into a first choice and a second chance. A choice I made my freshman year of high school to pick up that first drink, to pick up that first drug, which would change my life forever and lead me down that dark path of drug addiction where I learned the meaning of true pain, stigma, and struggle. But that same struggle is what made me the man who I am today. Finding a way out of that struggle is what gave me a real second chance at life. I found a way to take my mess and I turned it into a message, and this is the story of my journey to recovery. I always pose the question, what does a life of someone suffering from addiction, from a substance use disorder even look like? Are we homeless, middle class, wealthy? Do we come from a broken home? Were we abused as a child, or do we have a loving and supportive family? Do we struggle in school, academically, socially? Were we picked on, bullied, or were we a popular student athlete with a lot of friends? Male or female, black or white? The answer is all of the above and more, because addiction affects all walks of life. Before I go any further, I first want to thank all of you for coming out tonight and for the school for inviting me to speak today. I'm truly grateful to be here. Anytime I get a chance to share my story of recovery, it really is an amazing experience for me. If I can help one person avoid some of the mistakes that I made, help one person understand substance use and addiction just a little bit better, maybe put you in a position to help someone who's struggling, or even more important, prevent them from going down that path. If I can do any of that here tonight, then it was worth me to come here and speak. I've been sober for over 10 years, and I wouldn't trade it for anything. Everything good that I have in my life today is a direct result of sobriety. I'm at a point in my life today that I just didn't think was possible 10 years ago. If you were to tell me 10 years ago I would ever be back in any type of school or community setting at all, I would have just said, no, it's not going to happen. My thought process would be something like, drug charges are more serious in a school zone, so I can't go there. If you were to tell me 10 years ago I'd be getting invited to speak at middle schools, high schools, colleges, universities, different events all across the country, to share my story about my personal struggles with substance use, now as a sober man, I would have told you you're insane, you're out of your mind, and it's never going to happen. The truth is that I was the one that was insane, and I was the one that was completely out of my mind. Once I became addicted to drugs, especially opiates, which are any type of prescription narcotic painkiller, or the drugs that are killing people every single day, heroin, and now fentanyl. Once I became addicted to these types of drugs, I could not see a life without it. My way of thinking was so wrong. These drugs turned me into someone I am not, made me do things that I wouldn't normally do, and I had to suffer the consequences because of it. Some of those consequences I still live with today. Tonight, I am going to share my story with you. I always start first by telling you what this is not going to be. This is not going to be me telling you exactly how to parent your kids or coach your athletes or teach your students. What I do, what I found to be most effective, and most of all, what really worked for me, was hearing a real life story. You're going to hear about what I had to go through, what my family had to go through, what my friends had to go through. Some of my friends have made it through with me. Some are still out there using and misusing drugs and alcohol. I have some friends who are in prison, and some of them have unfortunately lost their life to addiction or substance use. And when I say addiction, I mean a fatal progressive illness. Fatal meaning, yes, you can lose your life from it. It can happen in a number of ways. Today, it's most commonly associated with a drug overdose, or specifically an opioid overdose. As of a few weeks ago, I now know 49 people personally who have died of a drug overdose, and almost all of them were in their 20s and they passed away. Yes, I'm in recovery, I work in this field, so you can say I'm around people who are more high risk, but 49, that's still a very alarming number. Now, the truth is, and most of your kids and most of your students will never get there, and I hope that none of them ever do, but you're going to hear in my story how I was able to get there. This can also be fatal through a drunk driving accident, which in my opinion can be even worse, because not only can you take your own life, you can take somebody else's as well. Now, it's fatal, but it's also progressive, meaning it almost always starts with nicotine, marijuana, and alcohol. And especially today with marijuana and alcohol, I hear this gateway drug argument from so many different people, from students and teachers and parents and counselors. So a few years back, I was working a drug and alcohol treatment program, and me and some of my friends were having this gateway drug debate. Are marijuana and alcohol gateway drugs, meaning they lead to other substances? Most people said yes. A few people said no. Then at one point, I just said, you know what? Maybe they're not gateway drugs. Maybe I just made a whole bunch of bad choices, and that's how I ended up where I did. Now, as I said that, the program director happened to be walking by. He heard what I said, calls me into his office. I go in there, I sit down, he says, I want to ask you a few questions. I said, sure, no problem. He says, question number one, the first time you ever tried a hard drug, and what he meant by hard drug was pills, powders, heroin, cocaine, Xanax, things like that. He said, the first time you ever tried a hard drug, were you under the influence of marijuana? I thought about it, I said, yeah, actually I was. He said, okay, the first time you ever tried a hard drug, were you under the influence of alcohol? Yes. What about the second time? Yes. Anytime you got arrested by the police, were you under the influence of marijuana, alcohol, or both? Yeah, almost every time. All right, last question. Is it safe to say that all of this started for you with marijuana and alcohol? I said, yeah, I guess you're right. And he said, well, think about that and get out of my office. And so I thought about it, and the truth is your ability to make good choices is greatly reduced when under the influence of marijuana, alcohol, or even worse, both. This is especially true for young people. And I don't care if alcohol is legal when you're 21. I don't care they're legalizing marijuana in states all across the country. To me, it's irrelevant. It doesn't matter. Whether something is legal or illegal on a piece of paper has no effect on your brain and on your body. Your brain is not fully developed until you are 25 years old, so the earlier you start using, the more likely it turns into an addiction. Now, I'm also not the guy who's going to stand up here and tell you that if any of your kids ever vape or drink or smoke, they'll definitely die or end up in prison. I have heard some speakers before take a zero-tolerance approach, and they say if your kids ever try anything, one of three things will eventually happen. They will die from an overdose, they will end up in prison, or they will be homeless and addicted. And I know you know it's not necessarily true. But when speaking to young people, you have to put it back on them. Ask them, what do you really want from your life? Are you willing to take the risk of ending up the way that I did, or even worse, and really ask them to think about how their actions are impacting and influencing other people? Make it bigger than just the individual, and here's why. I always share this experience I had with a senior high school student a few years ago. So a few years ago, I spoke at a high school, grades 9 through 12, about 700 students in this assembly. Afterwards, I had students coming up to me, thanking me, asking me questions, except for this one senior. This big guy just kind of stands off to the side, and he's looking at me, and I can tell by the way he's looking at me that he wants to talk to me, but he wasn't going to do it until there was nobody else around. So sure enough, he waited until everybody left the auditorium, starts walking over towards me. He shakes my hand, he says, listen, man, I really enjoyed your presentation. I thought the story was very inspiring. I learned a lot, but, and I'm like, all right, here it comes. And he says this very quickly to me. I vape, I drink, I smoke. I've been doing it since my freshman year. I'm now a senior. I get good grades, I'm already in college. I only do it every once in a while. Now, I heard you say that one bad choice under the influence could change or end my life forever, but I don't make really bad choices under the influence. I also heard you say you could potentially develop an addiction later in life. Doesn't have to happen right away. But I don't think I have an addictive personality, so I am willing to take the risk. But thank you for sharing your story. Now, I'll be honest with you, at first he had kind of got me a little bit. I never had a student come at me so directly and prepared before, and I really appreciated the fact that this student was obviously listening to what I had to say, so I didn't want to leave him with, like, good luck, I hope it works out for you. So I said to him, all right, maybe that's true. I disagree, you can never know for sure. But I asked him, why don't you think about how your actions are influencing other people? He looked at me sideways, like he was kind of confused, and he said to me, I don't get it. What does me using drugs and alcohol have to do with anybody else but me? So I asked him a few questions, and it turned out he was the captain of his football team and the captain of his lacrosse team. He had a younger brother and a younger sister. So whether he likes it or not, his actions do matter. And it's almost even worse that he's not the type of student that has all these really bad negative consequences from using drugs and alcohol, because then someone like me, is exactly how it happened to me in high school. I come in as a freshman. I made the varsity ice hockey team, the junior varsity lacrosse team, and I see a lot of the upperclassmen drinking, some of them smoking, and from the outside, it seemed like everything was okay. And while some of them were somehow able to manage it, they partied a little bit in high school, did some more drinking in college, got jobs, started families, and just kind of phased out of their lives. I do have some friends that pulled that off. I was definitely not one of those people. I got stuck in addiction for just over 10 years. And once you get stuck in it, it's so hard to get out. Addiction is a brain disease, and you're going to hear about how powerful it really is, both while it's actively using and still today being in recovery. And so the point to remember is while your kid may not be the one who develops the problem, their actions might be influencing someone who does. And for those parents who are in favor of hosting underage drinking parties, maybe your kid doesn't develop the problem, but somebody else's kid might be the one who does. Now, part of the reason why I made this introduction video, this was something that happened at 2 parent programs in a row that kind of motivated me to make this video. I had a mom pull me aside privately, and she said to me, "Are you leaving something out? Was there some traumatic event that happened in your childhood you're not talking about that led you down this destructive path?" And I understand that way of thinking, right? It makes more sense. This traumatic event happened in this person's childhood. Now they use drugs and alcohol to numb the pain, to deal with their problems. I understand that. Being in recovery and working in the field, I have certainly heard some very, very sad stories. Maybe it makes a little bit more sense. That is not my story, and that is not the story of most of my friends in recovery. I grew up in Rockland County, New York. It's about a half hour north of New York City. I have a very supportive family. My father's a lawyer. My mom's a computer programmer. Both of them are very involved in my life growing up and still are. I have 3 brothers. One brother who's a year older than me. He's a lawyer. He's married, has 2 kids. I have a brother who's 4 years younger than me, also a lawyer, recently married. And I have a brother who just graduated from college, and he works in financing. And none of them have ever had problems with drugs or alcohol. Never have, probably never will. So my brothers and I, we all grew up in the same house, same family, same type of friends. We all played sports. I mean, we pretty much did everything exactly the same. Why am I the one with the problem, but nobody else in my family has it? The only thing I can say to you, and I've learned over the years, I was either born with or developed the disease of addiction. What does that mean? When I take that first drink or that first drug, I can't stop that after it. It keeps getting worse, always progresses to harder things, and negative consequences follow, and it doesn't have to happen right away. I have some friends who started using in middle school, through high school and college, and then it caught up to them later in life. I can't say who it's going to happen to, if it's going to happen, how serious it's going to be. That risk, that choice, it's on each individual person. Now, with a story like mine, it is very easy to focus on the ending of my addiction where things were a complete disaster. But in order for there to be that ending, there had to be a beginning. So where did this all start for me? When I was in 8th grade, I made the junior varsity lacrosse team. So I was a middle school student playing a high school sport. So at the end of the school day, I'm getting bused over to the high school, and I'm practicing with freshmen, sophomores, even a few juniors. And I heard a lot of them talking about drinking, about smoking, going to parties. I was curious. I was definitely the type of student that was drawn to that. Now, I didn't use anything when I was in middle school, but as soon as I got into high school, that would change. Where I went to high school would always start in the first or second Wednesday in September, and at the time, it was kind of a tradition that the seniors would throw a big party for the whole school on that first Friday. So me and a few of my friends who went to this party, it was at the back entrance to this park. There were about 6 kegs of beer there. Half the school was there. I saw some people drinking, others smoking. I knew what I was getting myself into, but I guess what surprised me at first was some of the people that I saw doing it. Some of them were captains of sports teams. Kids that I grew up with who came from supportive families did well in school, and so I just thought to myself, this just must be the way things go in high school. I'll drink and smoke a little bit on the weekends. I'll still do well in school. I'll play sports. I'll graduate, and then I'll go off to college. That night, I had met a girl who was a senior, and she had dated one of my older friends. And a few weeks later, that same girl came into our school the morning of our pep rally. We had about 1,500 students in the high school at that point, and we had this pep rally at the beginning of October. Everybody would pile into the gym. The band would play. We did all this stuff for school spirit. It was supposed to be a really good time. What the administration didn't know on that morning was that some of the seniors started drinking alcohol early in the morning before school, and a few of them even brought alcohol into school. So these 3 girls are drinking all morning throughout the pep rally, which ended just before lunchtime. Seniors were allowed to drive. So these 3 girls, they walk out to the high school parking lot. They're all drunk. They get in a convertible. They pull out. They're going down the road, lose control of it. It flipped over. 2 of the girls were hurt, and one of them was killed. Now, I didn't know her very personally. I only met her that one time, but I had a lot of friends that are very close with her. And I do remember very well what it was like that next day in school. The hallways were completely silent, and if it wasn't silence, it was just people crying. I don't bring up this story in a way to try and scare or upset people. I bring up this story to remind you that you do not have to be addicted to drugs and alcohol for bad things to happen. I get that argument all the time from students, and to be completely honest with you, I get it from some parents too. Parents know who I am and what I do, find the need to pull me aside and say, well, my kid does vape and sometimes they drink and they smoke, but they're not addicted, so it's okay, right? No, this girl did not have a major problem with drugs or alcohol. She was your average student athlete, made one bad choice, and lost her life because of it. I remember the time a lot of the sports teams got together, said we're going to stay sober this year, we're going to do it for her. Well, it's sad to say the shock of her death did not last very long, if at all. Before long, everyone was back to doing what they were doing, and I wanted to take part in it. My freshman year, I went to that first party. Few things I did not have that night. I did not have strength in numbers. I did not have like-minded friends who were going to support each other to stay sober that night. I didn't have those key refusal skills, that self-confidence, that self-esteem. Not so much what you say, but how you say it, your facial expressions, your tone of voice, your body language. All that stuff matters, and I didn't have any of that. And so I walk up to this party. I see one of my older friends. He calls me over, pours me my first beer, and in that moment, I didn't have that self-confidence to refuse. Seconds later, somebody handed me a cigarette. That night, I used nicotine and alcohol. A few months later, similar situation, this time marijuana. Did it a few times my freshman year. By the end of that school year, I didn't really see any negative consequences. I did pretty well in school. I had a good family life, a lot of friends. I excelled in sports, so I just said to myself, I'm good. I'm not going to be that guy. But the summer going to my sophomore year, this is when things started to change. I went to another party, and the new captain of my lacrosse team just comes up to me and hands me a half ounce of marijuana. It's all bagged up in individual bags, and he says to me, I want you to sell this for me. Give me this amount of money, keep the rest for yourself. I'm 14 at the time. He's 17, he's a senior. You can just call this classic peer pressure. I said to him, you want me to sell it for you? No problem. There were a lot of people at this party. I sold it all in a few hours. I gave him his money. He walks out to his Jeep, comes back, hands me another one. He says, you know what? I want you to keep on doing this for me. So the summer going to my sophomore year of high school, I started selling marijuana from one of my older friends. Now I have it all the time. Now I'm smoking all the time. Quickly, for my freshman year, not really having any negative consequences, that started to change my sophomore year. I failed my first class. I was ineligible to play sports because of my grades. My behavior started to change. I started hanging out with a different group of friends. Our only purpose of hanging out with each other was to use drugs. Everything about me was changing. The way I acted, the type of music I listened to. I listened to the type of music that glorifies violence and selling and using drugs and degrading women. I became very secretive. I was locking doors everywhere I went. I became a liar. I was dishonest about almost everything. I'm asking for money all the time for drugs, and I stopped asking for money. Why? Because now I was selling it. You take all of this together, you see a pretty big change in someone, and it happened quickly for me. Nothing really drastic happened my sophomore year, but my junior year, under the influence of marijuana and alcohol, I tried cocaine for my first time. Then I sold prescription for Xanax to one of my friend's moms, tried that for my first time. Got my hands in a bunch more, and these pills just turned me into somebody I am not. I became very angry. I was getting in trouble in school. I got suspended. Then I came back just in time for some tournament my school hockey team had. I didn't get any playing time in the first period because I just come off a suspension. So I walked to the locker room. I took off my helmet. I threw it across the locker room in anger. And my coach just comes up to me and says, if you don't want to be here, just leave. I took him literally. Took out my equipment, put my clothes on, I stormed out. Once the game was over, I had calmed down, and I went up to him and I apologized, but he said, doesn't matter, that was the last straw, you are kicked off the school hockey team, get out of here. And then I just lost it. I started screaming at him, I cursed at him, I said some things I definitely should not have said, and if I wasn't kicked off a team before, well, I definitely was now. So I'm 16 years old, it's my junior year of high school, and I had two identities. I had sports and drugs. Sports was gone. I dove into drugs completely. At 16 years old, I stopped going to high school. I was given 10 days out of school suspension for cursing at my coach, which at the time I thought it was a gift. I don't have to go to school for 10 days, fine by me. All I did was use drugs all day long, fall further behind in my classes, came back for maybe 1 or 2 more days, and then I just dropped out of high school. Eventually the school caught on and wasn't showing up. They called my parents. My parents sat me down. They were like, "What are you doing? You're throwing your life away." And I just said to them, "I only went to school to play sports. Sports are gone, so I'm not going back." Even some of my friends tried talking to me. I wasn't listening. My parents didn't know what to do, so a few days later I came home really late. I was under the influence and I fell asleep on the couch. Around 5 in the morning, I get woken up, and these 2 Marines, these military guys, were standing over me. One of them says to me, "Stephen, you are coming with us." I had no idea what was going on. Pretty much what happened was my parents had hired them as what's called sober escorts to drag me out of my house in the middle of the night and send me to a wilderness program. For those that don't know what a wilderness program is, it is definitely not a fun place to be. Pretty much what it is, a therapeutic style boot camp environment. They would scream at me, they would yell at me, they'd break me down, they'd make me talk about my feelings, had to hike these big packs on my back all day, had to cook my food over a fire. There were no bathrooms, there were no showers. If you wanted to shower, they hand you a bucket of water and soap. No cell phones, nothing. I was there for almost 8 weeks. It was not a great experience, but I do remember the first night very well. The first night just laying there in this tent thinking to myself, how did I get here? 2 years earlier, I had not even tried drugs and alcohol before. Now I'm in some program in the middle of the woods in Georgia. Happened that fast for me. And a lot of people that go to these type of programs, they don't get to go back to their old high school afterwards. They get sent to what's called a therapeutic boarding school, and I was doing everything I possibly could to convince my parents to give me one more chance. I can only communicate with them through letters, so I didn't find out until the day before I was set to leave that my parents were going to let me come home just in time for the start of lacrosse season my junior year, and I was really excited about it. Now, you could say at first I was scared straight a little bit. People told me when I first came home I was very quiet, I was timid, which was not my personality at all, and there was this home contract that was made, and I had to follow all these rules. Rule number 1, very plain and simple: no drugs, no alcohol, to be completely sober. I had to go to support groups, see a counselor, maintain a certain GPA, I had a curfew, all these positive things, and I was following all the rules. Then right before lacrosse season started my junior year, the administration of my high school decided to extend my suspension from ice hockey into lacrosse season. They said they wanted to send a message to the rest of the students that if you cursed at your coach or do anything like that at all, you were done with sports for the entire school year. I remember this meeting took place at the end of the school day, and I'm standing in the hallway watching all my friends get on the bus to go to practice, and I had to go home. Thinking to myself, I am never going to get out from under this reputation as this bad kid. My father always talked about reputation growing up and how important it really is. Well, it became very clear to me on that day what he was trying to tell me. So instead of playing sports after school, I was hanging out with my older friends all day and getting high. Eventually, I relapsed, started this all over again. Went into my senior year. For a short period of time, beginning of my senior year, I was kind of flying under the radar, meaning I was still using drugs and alcohol, but I was showing up to school, I was passing all my classes, I wasn't getting into trouble, and so I thought to myself, okay, I let it get out of control once, but this time I can control it, and I was wrong. Right before hockey season started my senior year, I got a call from one of my friends early in the morning that changed my life forever. He says to me, my sister just got her wisdom teeth pulled. The doctor prescribed her 30 oxycodone, these opioid painkillers. So we sold the prescription and said, let's try it. Me and 2 of my friends, we smoked marijuana before school. We took a few of these oxycodone painkillers. One of my friends took it. Within 15, 20 minutes, he started throwing up. It made him nauseous. He hated the way it made him feel. Another one of my friends took it and liked it. But me, I took it. I remember walking the back of math class and sitting down when this feeling came over me, and I just thought to myself, this is what I'm looking for. I want this feeling, and I want it all the time. The point to remember is you get 3 different people take the same drug, and you get 3 different reactions. Why did it make my friend nauseous, and why did I get addicted to the feeling instantly? I can't tell you that for sure, but what it shows you is everyone is different, and that's either a risk that you're willing or not willing to take with any substance. Now, that should have never even happened in the first place. In terms of opioid misuse prevention, if your kid is ever in a situation where they break their arm, they break their leg, they have to have their wisdom teeth pulled, some type of surgery, and a doctor prescribes you opioid painkillers, at the very least, stop and ask, do I really need these? Is there something non-narcotic my kid can try first? The truth is we're prescribed opioid painkillers in situations where we don't really need them. Now, I'm not a doctor, so I cannot tell you what you should and should not take. But painkillers are only prescribed for one reason, to kill pain. So if you ever are in that situation, you can at least ask that simple question. If the doctor says, yeah, you're going to be in a lot of pain, you're probably going to need these, don't go home with a prescription for 30 or 60. I've even seen 90 before. Ask for the least amount possible. If you need more, they can always call some more in for you. When you're done with it, meaning when your pain subsides, not when you just finish the prescription bottle, get rid of it. That doesn't mean leave it in your medicine cabinet or throw it in your garbage. They have prescription drop boxes at pharmacies, at police stations. Get rid of it, and the last thing you do is you talk to your kid. How did it make you feel? Like I said, some people can't even understand how you get addicted to something like that. They get nauseous, they throw up. If your kid really liked the way it made them feel, well, that's something to take into account in the future. Now, my opioid addiction didn't get out of control right away simply because I didn't have access to them all that much. That would change as soon as I got out of high school, but things really didn't work out for me at all my senior year. I ended up switching high schools at one point just to try and play ice hockey. Came back to my old high school the last semester of my senior year, and because of everything going on in my life, I made the choice not even play lacrosse. I played every single year since I was in 3rd grade. It was my favorite sport. I was very good at it. They were handing out college scholarships left and right, and the height of my athletic career, I just threw it all away for drugs and alcohol. I did graduate high school, but barely, and I can't just stand up here and blame other people for what happened to me. I have to take responsibility for my own actions. At the end of the day, I let drugs and alcohol get in the way of my success. I went to a community college in upstate New York. I simply was not ready for college. I went there in August. Unlike middle school and high school, you don't show up to class at college. Nobody really cares. And so all I did there was party. By the time it was October, I had failed out. Now I had to move back home with my parents. I'm 18 years old. I'm not in school. I'm not working. And now I developed a serious drug habit. So I got involved in dealing drugs and no longer on a small level. And so naturally, the police came into my life. At 18 years old, I was arrested for my first time for possession of marijuana. About a month later, I got arrested again, possession of marijuana, possession of a controlled substance, was caught with a few painkillers. Then I was sent to my first 28-day inpatient program for drug and alcohol treatment. I did this from age 18 to 24. I would get arrested, I would go into treatment, I would come out, and I would do it all over again. Except each time my criminal charges were getting more serious. My substance use was getting more serious. And what I didn't know when I got out of that first treatment program, this is about much more than simply not using drugs and alcohol. I had to change my thinking, the way I acted, the people I hung out with, the places I went, and the things I did. I was not ready to make those changes. How do I even make those changes at 18 years old when almost all my friends were doing it? So instead I surrounded myself with negative influence and temptation, and every time would lead me back, but each time was worse than the next. Throughout the next 6 or 7 years, I made a lot of bad choices. When I was 19, I flipped off a cliff on a four-wheeler under the influence, and I compound fractured my right femur bone, which means my thigh bone was cracked in half and sticking out of my body. I was in the middle of the woods. It was January in New York. It was freezing cold outside, and I was in a really bad spot. Very lucky to be alive today. I am very lucky I could even walk today. 2 of my friends since elementary school were now paramedics from the area. I got the 911 call. They came there, and they literally saved my life. But I was in a wheelchair for 4 months. I was not fully healed for about a year, and at the beginning, I was in excruciating pain. And this is one of those situations where I was prescribed opioid painkillers by a doctor, and at the beginning, I really needed them. Now, I used to use this as what I would call my socially acceptable excuse as to why I got addicted to opioid painkillers. I would tell people I got in a really bad accident, the doctor prescribed me too many and that, so I got addicted, but it's not really true. I was high in opioids and I made that horrible choice. And after the doctor prescribed them to me, I was more than doubling and tripling my dose by buying them illegally on the street. I go for my first follow-up appointment with this doctor, and I think she's going to prescribe me more. But she says, you don't need these anymore. Just take Advil or Tylenol. I walk out of there very angry. Call my drug dealer. I tell him the doctor won't give me any more opioids. I really need some right now, but he didn't have anything that day. I had been misusing these pills for months, and all of a sudden, one day, I just stopped. And around 24 hours went by, and I'm sitting there in the wheelchair next to my friend, and I said to him, I don't know, man, I'm starting to feel sick. I feel like I have the flu or something. And he looks at me and he says, you don't have the flu, you're dope sick. And I said, dope sick, what does that even mean? He says, you're physically addicted to opioids, and because you stopped using, your body's going through withdrawal. But check this. I know a guy, I'll go on the street, I'll buy this pill Oxycontin, I'll bring it back, I'll break it up, you'll snort it, and that sick feeling will go away almost instantly. Honestly, I didn't believe him. I just thought I had the flu or something. I never experienced anything like this before from stopping using drugs. Didn't make sense to me, but he said he was going to fix my problem. I gave him some money. He went on the street. He bought me this pill Oxycontin, brought it back, broke it up, said snort it. I did it. That sick feeling was gone almost instantly, and that was the first time I realized I was physically addicted to opioids, and drugs like that will take you down very, very quickly. It's progressive. At the height of my addiction, I had a 900 milligram a day Oxycontin habit. On the street, it was going for as much as $1 a milligram. That's $900 a day. How does somebody afford a drug habit like that? Well, that's why I got involved in dealing drugs, illegal gambling, things I think about today I cannot even believe I was involved in. But when your brain is addicted, when your body is addicted, you don't think about the consequences. You don't think about how your actions are hurting other people. And this is also the reason why so many people turn to heroin, because it's cheaper and it's readily available, except today it's laced with a very powerful substance called fentanyl. Drug cartels have figured out how to make fentanyl, which is a synthetic opioid, which means a man-made opioid that's 50 to 100 times more powerful than heroin and morphine, and they're using it to lace, which means mix in all different types of substances. Now, there's this other drug called xylazine. On the street, it's called Trank. It's actually an animal tranquilizer. They're using that to mix substances as well. It is truly the most dangerous time in history to be using drugs because things like fentanyl and xylazine are popping up everywhere. This is a bold statement to say, but if what is going on today was going on 10 years ago when I was still using, there is no way I would have made it out alive. It is that much more dangerous to use drugs today. Once I got to that point, I basically lost everything. I lost all of my friends. I lost my family too. My parents were the last ones to go. My mom sat me down. My dad was standing behind her, and my mom said to me, you need to leave our house today, right now. Until you are ready to go away and get long-term treatment, do not call us. Do not call anybody in this family. Leave today. Goodbye. So I left, ended up getting my own place in New Jersey, and I was involved in criminal activity at a level at this point. I just had a feeling something very bad was going to happen, and it did. Christmas Eve of 2011, I come home to my apartment. There's about 10 police cars in front of it. I think they're there to arrest me, which they were, but it was much worse than that. Growing up when I was a kid, I had this friend, and we were told by our parents to never get in the car with his father. When we were little kids, we had no idea why, but as we got older, we found out he was addicted to crack cocaine. He found out where I lived, knew I had drugs and money in my home, came there with two other guys. One guy had a knife, the other one had a bat. They had duct tape and rope. Their plan was to break into my apartment, steal my drugs and my money. If they couldn't find it, wait for me to get home, beat me, tie me up, and make me tell them where it was. Now, even at my worst, I was not a violent person. I really didn't associate with many violent people, But I bring up this part of my story because when you get involved in drugs, you have no idea what can come through that door. I was very lucky I wasn't home that night. They broke my back window trying to break in. My neighbor heard it. She called 911. Police got there very quickly and caught them, but also gave the police what's called exigent circumstances to go inside and make sure no one's hurt. Well, they knew who I was, and they used the opportunity to search, and they found all my drugs and all my money, and now I'm being charged at the felony level. I say this to students every time I speak at a high school. You want to go off, you want to have a job, you want to have a career, you get that criminal record tied to you and could haunt you for the rest of your life. I have a friend who went to Yale University and Wharton Business School. That's one of the best universities, one of the best business schools in the country. When he was in business school, he made one really bad choice one night, ended up getting convicted of a felony, graduated, couldn't get a job in financing because of his criminal record. Now, still to this day, going on 13 years ago. My situation's a little bit different. I was arrested in New Jersey. The laws are a little bit more lenient than New York, where my friend was arrested. And because I was a nonviolent offender, I can have my charges expunged, which means erased from my record, but it takes a minimum of 10 years. And it's a very long, painful, and expensive process. And I did have to plead guilty to a felony. I remember that day in court so well. I had like this rewind moment back to 13 years old. If someone were to tell me at 13 years old when this all started that by the time I was 24, I would be a convicted felon for drug charges, I mean, at 13, I probably would have laughed at you. But if you told me 100% these choices I was making at 13 years old, this is where it was going to lead, I would have never started in the first place. I was put on felony probation. I was being drug tested. I was being monitored by the state. I had a probation officer, and it still was not enough for me to stop because I just kept hanging around the same people in the same places, doing the same thing over and over again. Sometimes during the Q&A, I've been asked, what was the lowest moment in your addiction? And for me, it was being on felony probation in New Jersey, staying at my parents' house in New York, just sitting there with my grandmother when all of a sudden the police kick in the door and arrest me again on more felony drug charges, right in front of my grandmother. They handcuffed me, they walked me out in front of all my neighbors, and the craziest part about that day for me was that I didn't even really care. I was so broken and lost at that point. I had pretty much accepted my fate as prison and eventually death. But this was 3 weeks before my older brother's wedding. It was supposed to be a really happy time for my family. Here I am again, just messing it up for everyone. This is why we say addiction is a family disease, because it affects a lot more than just the person who's actually using drugs or alcohol. I was bailed out of jail to make it to my brother's wedding on September 28, 2012. And on September 29, 2012, at around 3 in the morning, I took my last drink and my last drug. September 30th, 2012 was my sobriety date. Now, at the time that I think it was going to be my last, I really wasn't sure, but I wasn't left with many options. I had to be back in the treatment program by Monday morning. Otherwise, I was being remanded to the Bergen County Jail. So I walked back in this treatment program. I had been there about 9 months earlier, and my old counselor is just standing at the door waiting for my arrival. I'm walking up, and I see him, and I put my head down in shame. He tells me to pick my head up, and he looks at me, and he says, "Are you ready?" And for the first time in my life, I just stopped fighting. I surrendered, and I said to him, "Please just tell me what to do, because clearly I have no idea." So he sent me to a year-long treatment program with 3 different phases, which pretty much what that means is as you progress through the phases, you get more and more freedom. But the first day of this program, I walked around to the back deck. All the residents were out some activity, so it was just me, staff members, and counselors. And I see this one staff member hitting this vape. This is before Juuls were around. It was this bigger vaping device. It was fairly new at this point. I never tried it. Went up to him. I said, "Is that a vape?" He said, "Yeah, it's nicotine. I'm using it to try and quit smoking cigarettes. Here, take a hit." I hit it. I coughed my lungs out. I didn't think anything of it. Then all the residents came back, and almost every one of them had this vape in their hands. And we were told at that time that this is a not as harmful alternative to help us quit smoking cigarettes, and then we can quit vaping at any time. That is definitely not the way it went at all. I became more addicted to nicotine in treatment than I ever was when I was actively using other drugs and alcohol. Nicotine was the first drug I ever tried and was the last one to go. I vaped and smoked cigarettes my first 2 years in recovery because it was that hard for me to quit. But at that time, I had given up everything else, and I started working this program, and it wasn't until around month 5 or 6 of being sober, I was going about my day, I realized that when I woke up that morning, drugs wasn't the first thing on my mind. Every single morning, I woke up with the same thought process. Do I have drugs? Okay. If not, how am I going to get them? Around month 5 or 6, I didn't have that thought. I ate lunch, I met with my case manager, a counselor watching over me, and I told him, and he smiled back at me. And he said, this is when recovery is really going to start working for you, so give it your best shot. I walked out of his office that day and I made a choice. I made a choice to give myself a real second chance at life, knowing how hard this was going to be for me, but because I prepared myself for how hard it was going to be, I was willing to ask for help, and I had that support there with me. It made it a little bit easier. I wanted to make big changes in my life, and so I was taught, start with the small things. I created a morning routine. I set my alarm every morning, I got up on time. I made my bed, I cleaned my room, I organized my stuff, I brushed my teeth, I took a shower, and I started my day. I did it all mindfully. I still do a lot of it to this day. I went back to the gym. I was eating healthier. I was going to support groups. I made some really close friends in recovery, and we supported each other through our common struggle. Then in phase 2 of this program, they let me enroll in just 2 classes at a community college. I had failed almost every single college class I'd ever taken, and now I got A's in both of these classes. Why? It was the first time I ever took a college class sober. Then in the final phase of this program, they made me what's called a resident house manager, which just meant I was still a resident in the program, but trusted enough to watch over some of these younger guys. All of these good things slowly started coming into my life, and it was because I was living a life in recovery, and that's not about just not using drugs and alcohol. It's about being a good person. It's about doing the next right thing. It's about helping other people. It's about building a life that's worth protecting. I had to create a life that was worth staying sober for. It works for me on the recovery side, should work for your kids and your students on the prevention side. Build a life worth protecting. You work so hard in your academics, your athletics, your health, your wellness, your relationships. You work so hard for something. Are you really willing to put something into it, like drugs and alcohol, that could take it all away? I was doing the right thing, but I had one very big problem. I was told by my lawyer there was a chance I would have to go to prison in both New York and New Jersey. He told me if I do everything I'm supposed to do, hopefully at the end we can convince the courts otherwise. Month 11, I'm going about my day. My cell phone rings. The program director. He says, come to my office. I have some news for you. I go in there. I sit down. He says to me, I just got off the phone with your lawyer. Here's what's happening to you. You don't have to go to prison in New Jersey. The courts there are agreeing to dismiss your probation after you successfully complete our program. You don't have to go to prison in New York either. The courts there are agreeing to count our program as drug court, which is an alternative to incarceration. Part of the way we were able to convince the courts to do this is because you did so well here. We're going to offer you a full-time job working here at our treatment program. We're going to put you in a management position, give you a salary and health insurance. How's that sound to you? I was just blown away. For the longest time, I had convinced myself that recovery, a healthy, a meaningful life was not possible for someone like me. Remember the beginning I said junkie, dope fiend, drug addict, drunk, dropout, felon. By the time I was 16 years old, I had convinced myself I was a failure. I acted on that mindset for 8 more years, and I almost lost my life because of it. But now I was given a real second chance. We talked for a while. We joked around before I walked out. The program director gave me a big hug, and he said to me, you might have one more high left in you, but I seriously doubt you have more recovery. Take this gift that you've been given and go do something extraordinary. Go use it to help a lot of people. And I haven't looked back ever since. I live my life in a completely different way today. Have a lot of people to thank for it. People who spoke up when things need to be said. And it applies here too. And almost every single school I speak at, I get a student who comes up to me afterwards and says, I have a friend, a brother, a sister. They're going down the wrong path and I want to speak up, but I don't want to be labeled as a snitch or a rat or a narc or someone who tells on other people. And I understand that fear, but it's so important to explain and to keep explaining the difference between being a snitch and a good friend. A snitch is someone who gets in trouble and tries to get other people in trouble to save themselves. But if you speak up because you're genuinely concerned about someone, if you speak up and your motive is to help them, that just makes you a good person. It makes you a good friend. There's a big difference between the two. All you have to do is check your motives, check your intentions, ask yourself, why am I speaking up? Am I speaking up and trying to help this person? Because if you are, then you are doing the right thing. And for parents, if you hear something about somebody else's kid, don't gossip about it. Go directly to that parent and say what you heard. Now, some parents say to me, well, I don't do it because I know they're going to get defensive and they're going to tell me to worry about my own kid. That may be the reaction, but you did your part, and I know as a parent, if one of my kids was doing something, I would want to know about it. After all those years, I finally realized that there were so many great opportunities out there for me. So many ways I could actually live my life without the use of drugs and alcohol, and now I do it every single day. I actually found a way to take all my pain and all my struggle, and I figured out what I really want to do with my life. I found what my passion is, and it's doing this right here. Some studies say that one of America's #1 fears more than anything else is public speaking. I was missing out on great opportunities every single day out of fear. Fear of rejection, fear of failure. Fear was at the root of it all for me. I was able to get past those fears because other people believed in me first, which helped me believe in myself. There was something I really wanted to do, and so I just went out there and did it. I left my job with that treatment program just before I celebrated 2 years of recovery to go back to college, majoring in criminal justice with the goal of going to law school one day, knowing how hard that would be for me because of my criminal history. But I gave it everything I had. I went to John Jay College of Criminal Justice in New York City. My final semester there, I started applying to law schools, studying for my law school admissions test. But I knew I needed more, so I decided to start this, Speak Sobriety. I wanted to share my story, especially with young people, in a way that was never presented to me when I was in middle school or high school, not knowing if even one school or coalition would ever agree to bring me in as a speaker. This is my 7th school year doing this officially. I've had the opportunity to speak for over 500 different schools and coalitions all across the country. I recently graduated from Brooklyn Law School, took the bar exam, passed. I'm a criminal defense attorney in New York. I published a book called A Journey to Recovery with the help of one of my old teachers. I got married last summer. I have my family back in my life. I have true friends today, friends who support me in what I do, and I support them in what they do, and now I have a 1-year-old daughter at home to take care of. I have all these amazing things in my life today because I live this life, this sober lifestyle, centered around wellness, making healthy choices, helping other people, but most of all, because somebody gave me a second chance. I want to save some time for a few questions. Thank you all for being here tonight, and thank you for letting me share my story. So if anyone has any questions, feel free, raise your hand, ask a question, shout it out, whatever you want to do. There's a lot of different ways of doing it. I think sometimes that we focus just on the drugs and the alcohol, but, one of the things that Rachel, the head of school, said to me today was, she said, the #1 line I love the most about your presentation was build a life worth protecting. And she said, and then for you is creating a life that's worth staying sober for, but you can make it bigger than that, and that's, talking about building a life worth protecting and really trying to emphasize, especially at like a private school like this, really busy schedules, working really, really hard to get somewhere, and the amount of pressure they put on themselves, and say, are you really willing to risk all of that just for a drink or a drug? And really just trying to emphasize how much more dangerous it is today, where it can lead, and just trying to fill the life of as many positive things as possible. Bigger point, too, for your juniors and seniors is leadership, right? How your actions affect other people. So that interaction I had with that senior student who came up to me afterwards and admitted that he vaped and he drank and he smoked, and I talked with the principal after the fact. He was like one of the smartest kids in the school. Just one of those kids that every once in a while wasn't really affecting his life negatively, but who knows how many people he influenced who reacted differently. And so really trying to identify some of those kids who have that natural leadership skill and really trying to capitalize on that. I think it's a very important piece. I spoke at another private school down in Florida this year, and I was there for 4 days. I did assemblies in the first day, and then I did 3 days of breakout sessions in like all the different grades, and it was a campus like this, and so I'm walking from one building to the next, and on the last day, this kid stops me, and he's like, hey, can I just talk to you for a minute? I'm like, yeah, sure. He says, really appreciate your message. He goes, I got to say, I've been thinking about, it was the last day. He's like, I've been thinking about talking to you for 3 days. He said, but I'm glad that you just walked by, because here's what I have to say to you is, so I'm the lacrosse captain. I'm a senior. And that story you told about that other senior, he goes, I feel like that's me. He's like, I don't smoke marijuana or vape. He goes, but I do drink alcohol, and I do it, almost every weekend. It's never been a problem for me. But he was like, thinking about it, some of the parties that we've thrown and some of the freshmen that have come, he goes, I could tell that like some of them can't really handle it. And so you really got me thinking, right? So just like little things like that, when you put somebody in a leadership position, not only does it help them as an individual, it helps other people around them. Because once they really realize like, wow, what I do matters for more than just myself, then all of a sudden you start acting differently. I mean, it will never be the same as like the feeling of like the day you become a parent, like where you realize like what I do now matters for much more than just myself. It will never be that impactful. But if you can really put people in that leadership position, I really do feel, especially the junior and senior level, that can trickle down to people below. So that's one of the areas I always emphasize for schools to focus on. And a lot of the times, and I heard it here too, a lot of times as much as sports is a positive outlet for people, it's where a lot of people are introduced to drugs and alcohol. And so if you are a coach and you're going to give somebody that role as a captain, well, great if they score 100 goals in a season, but what are they doing off the field? It's really important. Yeah, I know that. I could just tell by your guys' head nods, so I know. Yeah.
I just loved everything you said. And there's a point to my whole thing of what I was going to tell you, like where we really need to meet kids. But it isn't about like talking about the drugs. Like we don't need to do that. We need to talk about everything else. Like yeah, they know what the drugs are. They know that it hurt them. It's everything. And it's. I never asked the why. I never asked what you're using. I asked why you're using.
Mm-hmm.
Let's explore that. But the other thing that's really awesome, actually, about the county that you're in right now, and it's neighboring county, is we have a single county authority, which is the drug and alcohol program, who invest in our schools. So it's probably one of the few schools, districts around here in Pennsylvania. We have like 6 or 7 schools that actually pay into having a drug and alcohol person, K through 12. I am there 7 days a week. Those kids see me at registration. I go to the graduation, everything in between. I followed the girls softball team when they went to state too. Like I think it's a lot of that too. So having these kind of programs is phenomenal when follow-up like that. So I was saying, yeah, I always bring people in to talk. I love it. Then we say, like, how do we keep it going in the community? Let's have that conversation.
Correct, 100%. And I always say that. It's part of the reason why, I started doing breakout sessions too. Like I come back to schools and I meet with them in small groups afterwards to really do breakout sessions where it's like a Q&A, open discussion. You hear what's a positive takeaway, a lesson, a message, and then I just give some more practical prevention advice as well. Thank you.
And all those kids that heard you today. That is so powerful.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Go ahead.
I want to say thank you also. My daughter heard you today, so I'm really glad that I got to hear you. But I just wanted to know, do you believe in AA or NA?
I believe in it.
Did you go?
I went, so I don't, the reason why I don't speak about it is just because of the second word, right? Anonymous. So, and some people get upset with that. So I just Me, obviously, I'm not anonymous. I'm very open about it, but I do respect people who don't like that. So, especially some of your more old school AA type guys. So, yes, I do go to AA. I went to NA a long time ago. The meetings that I was going to, I found like it just wasn't as solid of recovery. And so I prefer AA, and most people in there are cross addicted. They have both. It used to be separate, where if you had a drug issue and you went to AA, there'd be some people in there who'd be like offended by that and say you're at the wrong meeting. But in my experience today, it's much better. I do have struggles with it for adolescents, though. A lot of struggles. They don't like it. And one of the problems with a group like that is you're required to say what? Your name and you are a drug addict or alcoholic. And if you're a teenager and you don't believe that you are one, that's a big hurdle to get over. And so I've had some struggles with that. In Connecticut, where I'd gotten sober, and there's only a few of these now, it's gaining some traction. It's actually called Move to Heal. And it's like a new organization, and basically it's run through CrossFit gyms. And they do a 30-minute workout first. It's like a workout that anyone could do. And then after the workout, they do a meeting, and you don't have to identify as an addict or an alcoholic. It's actually open to anyone who has depression, anxiety, trauma, substance use. It's more just about wellness than it is like there's no 12 steps, there's none of that type of stuff. And so I've taken some young guys that I coach to that, and they've actually liked it a lot better. So I try to incorporate physical fitness and mental health as much as I can. Like if I coach somebody on an individual level, I would pick them up in the morning, and then it would just be, they would curse me and tell me that why they don't want to be sober and why I'm the worst, and then we'd go work out, and then they would be in a completely different mood. So like getting those, especially for I found with young boys, that traditional therapy, sitting in an office, it's just, I try and get them literally physically moving while talking, and it actually works a lot better. Anyone have any other questions? Go ahead.
So I'm all about prevention and not having my children do any kind of drugs or alcohol. But in the circumstance where maybe they do, and we've said to our kids, if you've ever gotten into a situation, we don't want you to drive, call us, you won't get in trouble, but there should be a consequence to that. How do you manage that?
It's a great question. So when it's local, my father will come with me and speak, and he addresses that exact thing that you just said in his short talk that he does, because he said the exact same thing, and that there's not going to be a severe consequence, but there is going to be some type of consequence, but it can't be a severe one, because you're weighing the pros and cons. It's more about we're going to have a discussion, right? And so maybe the consequence is that we're going to go out to dinner, and you're not going to go out tonight. We're going to go out to dinner, and we're going to have a talk. That to me is the most important thing, because the fear of having even a minor consequence, it's outweighed, right, by what could happen if they end up going through it, getting in the car with a drunk driver, or just in a bad situation, right? So I would say that the consequence is not you're grounded for a month, or you're taking away this, you're taking away that. It's more, well, you know what, one of these weekend nights, we're just going to go out to dinner and we're going to talk. We're going to have a family discussion. But you should send that message to your kids, 100%. They can't fear you more than the consequences of drugs and alcohol. Right? So that's where that fear factor does not work. That cannot happen. I remember the situation in high school. There was an open house party at this one of my friend's house, and 20 minutes in, police come, everybody runs, we're all drunk, and people are running away, and I'm with my friend who has probably the strictest parents I know to this day. And I called my dad, and he came and he picked me up. He wasn't happy, But my friend would rather get in the car with a drunk driver because if his parents found out what was going on, he thought he'd be grounded for the rest of his life. So you got to try and find that balance. Yes, beforehand, you make your expectations clear, you make your consequences clear, right? You need to do all that stuff beforehand. I mean, those conversations really should be starting in third, at the very, the latest fourth grade. And the reason I say that too is because this was the first year I ever got a call from an elementary school to come speak because their fifth graders are vaping. Fifth. And so like I don't usually go that low. I think you should be talking about it. I just don't think I'm the one to be doing it. But you should be having those conversations at a very early age and letting them know this is not something that we do in this family, and make sure that your actions follow, and not just with drugs, with alcohol too. I got to tell you, so I spoke at a school district this year in New Jersey, and they had 3 middle schools. And so I went to each middle school on the first day, did assemblies, and then for the next 3 days, I was at each middle school for a full day doing breakout sessions. And at almost every single breakout session, these are all kids who heard my story. Kid, at 8th grade boy, 8th grade girl asked, so do you still drink alcohol sometimes? Got to ask that at almost every session. There's literally someone behind me that says, speak sobriety. And they heard my story and they're asking me, do I still drink alcohol? So for the first day I was answering it, I was like, no, I don't drink alcohol. The reason I don't drink is because when I get drunk, it brings me back to drugs. But the second day, I stopped answering the question and I started saying, let me ask you a question. Why didn't you ask me if I still smoke marijuana? And they said, well, we know you wouldn't do that. So, but why are you asking me if I drink alcohol? And it just shows you how different our youth look at alcohol compared to all drugs. And you can't blame them, right? What do? We say drugs and alcohol. We give alcohol its own special category. We put every single drug into one category, and then we say and alcohol. And that's one of my biggest struggles, is parents with alcohol and the way that they view it. It's just, to me, in my opinion, alcohol causes more problems than some of these other drugs do, for sure. So making sure that you're sending that message as well, that, I get it, like some adults who are over, 21, to me, it's not about 21, it's about 25, right? I go with the brain science here. Your brain is not fully developed until you're 25, so yeah, for an adult who's 25 and over and they're drinking alcohol, sure, as long as you're not doing it excessively, I don't have a problem with that, but really emphasizing the difference between an adult who has a fully developed brain versus a 20-year-old, or even worse, like a 15-year-old, and why it's not okay for them to drink versus an adult. That's a very important piece to emphasize. Any other questions? Okay, if you have any other questions or you want to get in contact with me, my website is speaksobriety.com. All my contact information is on there, but thank you all for coming out tonight. Have a good night. Thank you.